It's great to see this turnout. Thank you very much for coming out. I'm delighted to welcome you. My name is Andrew Petter. I'm the president of Simon Fraser University, and this is the first of the 2013-2014 series of President's Faculty Lectures. The President's Faculty Lectures are a part of SFU Public Square, and SFU Public Square is a signature initiative that we launched just over a year ago, really as part of our vision to be Canada's engaged university. It's our goal to be the most community engaged research university in the country. We've done that in a number of different ways. We had a major public square summit just a little while ago, but these lectures are a chance for us to connect with the community and showcase for your benefit some of the research and our very talented faculty members. So it's great to see this turnout today. We have a real opportunity tonight through this lecture to hear from someone who has some very important research to share, and there will be an opportunity after she's finished for some questions if you choose to ask some, or comments if you'd like her to react to those. And we also have some coffee and some cookies, so there'll be a chance after we wrap up to stay behind and have some coffee and cookies. And Elizabeth assured me she'll stay behind a little bit as well for any who have follow-up questions, because I'm sure we won't be able to accommodate all of the questions you may have following the lecture. So, great pleasure tonight. You're in for a real treat to hear from tonight's speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Elle. Dr. Elle is a professor, and she's also the chair of the Department of Biological Sciences at SFU. She also oversees the Elle Pollination Lab at SFU. Her research focuses, as I think you probably know, because you came here with a title in mind, but I'll tell you nonetheless that it focuses on the human activities on the biodiversity of pollinators like bees in wild places and in agriculture. Some bees are under threat of extinction. I think that's something that has been much in the news of late. And combined with declines in managed honeybee populations, there is the potential for negative consequences on our food supply. And this is something that Dr. Elle and her students are exploring. They're looking at ways to preserve pollination services to wildflowers and crops in the face of pollinator losses. The issue of pollinator health is, I think, a very controversial and very timely topic for us to focus upon. Indeed, I understand that Dr. Elle was recently at a major conference in Guelph, so we're lucky that she's back with us today in home turf to share her knowledge with us and to give you the benefit of some of her research. So with that, please join with me in extending a very warm welcome to Dr. Elizabeth Elle. Elizabeth?
Thank you so much. Thank you, President Petter, and thanks to all of you for coming. You're my reason for doing this stuff. It's such an honor to be able to come out in the community and talk to people about what we do and what we know, and also sometimes some of the things that we don't know. I want to acknowledge the collaborators that I've been working with over the years on this research. Their calling cards are up on the screen, but there's a certain segment of those collaborators that I especially need to acknowledge, and those are my students, and some of those are here tonight. So clearly, if you're here, you're interested in this topic, you're wondering if we're having a pollination crisis. I have to say, I've been studying pollination for more than 20 years, and it's probably only the last 3 to 5 years that people seem at all interested in the topic. And I keep wondering, what took you so long? Because this is what my breakfast would normally look like. So we've got some granola with nuts and seeds and fruit. We've got toast with jam. We've got some cranberry juice and some coffee. And yes, this is my yogurt. It just looks really ucky if I mix it in the photo. Sorry about that. That's in a world that has pollinators. And this is in a world without. So the fruit and nuts and seeds are gone, the jam is gone, the juice is gone, and the coffee is gone in this slide. And some of my colleagues would even say, well, maybe you should even be reducing the amount of yogurt in that picture. Well, last I checked, you don't need pollination to give milk if you're a cow, but cows do eat clover and they eat alfalfa, and those things do need pollinators. So a world with bees and a world without. It's estimated that about 90% of the flowering plants on our planet need an animal in order to reproduce. And the animals aren't doing it to help the plants in any way. It's kind of incidental. They go to the flower to get nectar and pollen for their own food and to feed their offspring. They bring it back to the nest. In visiting lots of flowers, they wind up moving pollen from flower to flower, and the result of that are fruits and seeds that we like to eat. It's estimated that fully 1 out of 3 bites that we eat is thanks to a pollinator of some sort. So that means things like the toast and the granola in the previous pictures that are wind pollinated, well, those aren't included. But anything that is a fruit or a seed that needs a pollinator can be considered part of this essential 1/3 of our diet. And the other thing I need to tell you is that about 70% of plant species, when we actually go out and study plant populations, experience what we call a pollination deficit. Basically, their reproduction is limited because they're not getting enough pollen delivered to the flower. So their reduction in fruit production, we call this deficit. And this is not just crops, although it does happen in crops, but also the wild plants that form the foundation of resilient natural ecosystems, and upon which the bears and the birds and the other animals rely. So pollination is important, so it's about time, really, that people started thinking about it. But boy, are we thinking about it. It's in the news all the time. It's in local papers, international papers. They did a whole Time magazine on it this summer. I don't know if you saw that. And there are various books about it. There's popular science books like the one on the left, a great book that came out well before people started really talking about this issue, and a fairly recent report by the National Research Council on the status of pollinators in North America. Doug Copeland, local boy made good, right? Even wrote a novel about it. He called Generation A, about a world where the honeybee has gone extinct. It's in the news a lot. And this is why. Honeybee populations are declining. And this actually isn't that new. If you've heard about colony collapse disorder, that is a fairly recent phenomenon that's barely captured by showing some of these drop-offs at the end of this time series. What we know actually is that honeybee populations have been declining since pretty much the advent of modern agriculture for a very long time. And that's part of the reason why we're concerned. And there are 3 main reasons. One is pesticide use, one is disease, and the third is the loss of habitat. And I'm going to talk about all 3 of those. So the thing about pesticides is that they're meant to kill bugs, okay? So you spray a pesticide on a crop because you've got caterpillars or beetles or something else that are eating the thing that you're trying to grow for food. So you spray a chemical that kills bugs. Well, not all bugs are bad bugs. Some are beneficial bugs, and I would say pollinators would fall into that category. So pesticide sprays have the potential to kill pollinators. Now, there's lots of rules about how you spray pesticides, so you're not supposed to spray them when the crop is in bloom and therefore attractive to pollinators that are looking for food. You're supposed to, if you have to spray during bloom, spray them at night. And the growers that I work with follow those rules, but nevertheless, sometimes accidents happen, and we see that there are pollinator die-offs. But more insidious and potentially more important in the long run is the impact of pesticide buildup in bees. So just to give you an idea, this figure shows for several different crops how much pesticides there are in the honeybees that are foraging in those crops. And what you can see is that some pesticide loads and the diversity of different kinds of pesticides that are in these bee bodies can be quite high. And that can have health consequences. What's especially concerning today, and you've probably heard about this, are some other kinds of, specific kinds, I should say, of pesticides, and even what we call spray adjuvants, the things that are mixed into the pesticides and not necessarily on labels, that just help it spread on the plants. And what's really concerning about some of these, things like neonicotinoids that you might have seen in the paper, is that they have these non-lethal effects that might be especially concerning for a foraging animal. So here on the left, what I'm showing you is as the dose of neonicotinoids goes up, the performance of bees, basically their ability to learn and their memory of how to do things like forage on flowers, goes down. And this little thing here, it says FR, that's the field realistic dosages. So the drop-off isn't that big under field realistic dosages, but it's still a drop-off. What this means is that when bees are out in the fields, they get disoriented. They have difficulty finding their way back to the colony. If they're exposed to things like neonicotinoids, they have trouble learning how to forage on a new kind of flower. The same thing is true of these spray adjuvants. So these are just different traits that were measured in this study that have to do with learning and retention of information. And what we see is that control bees are doing much better than those that have just been exposed to the so-called inactive ingredient in a pesticide. So again, the disorientation that seems to be happening in bees might be kind of the next big problem that we have to solve in agricultural systems. The next thing I want to mention is diseases. There's a frightening number of diseases that are affecting our honeybees, just like there's lots of diseases that affect people. So a small list. The one on top, I had to put the full name because anything that's called destructor is probably a problem. And this is what it is. It's on the back of this bee. It's kind of like a dinner plate size thing that's a parasite on our body. Imagine that, sucking out your juices. This is a problem, okay? There's also various viruses, fungi, bacteria. There's a whole host of diseases that are affecting honeybees. Now, most of these are not new, but some of them are emerging diseases, ones that haven't really been problems before. Others, the big issue is that they have evolved resistance to the treatments that honeybee keepers have been using to fight them. And so we try using something kind of like an antibiotic that we'd use against a bacteria that's making us sick, and some of those bacteria evolve resistance to antibiotics. It's the same thing in these cases. And so it's getting harder for beekeepers to fight this long list of diseases that are affecting the honeybee. And the third thing I want to mention is loss of habitat. And I thought the best way to demonstrate this was to just start with a Google map of where we are. So here's the Burnaby campus of Simon Fraser University. Here's Deer Lake Park. That's kind of where we are, okay? And what you can see is up here in the North Shore Mountains and in Port Moody, we've got lots of forests. That would be the natural condition in this part of the world, right? Well, all the rest of it, that habitat has been lost from its natural condition and converted for human use. But this kind of habitat conversion to suburban development is not the main cause of habitat loss globally. The main reason we lose habitat globally is because of agriculture. And so if we just move a little bit east, we can get a feeling for what that's like. So this is the Pitt Meadows area, and all of this is agricultural fields. And what you might know if you've been in that area is it's mostly blueberries. While blueberries are blooming, which is only a couple of weeks in the springtime, that's a lot of food for a bee. Lots of flowers with nectar for them to get at. The thing is, well, here's an analogy. Broccoli is really good for you. But how would you feel if that's all you got to eat for 3 weeks? Not so good. Right? So because these bees are exposed to these monoculture situations, their diet is actually quite compromised. They're not getting the diversity of vitamins and micronutrients that they really would benefit from if they were in a more diverse kind of place. And of course, outside of when the blueberries are blooming, this is pretty much a food desert for bees. There's nothing much there for them to eat. Okay, so that's habitat loss. And of course, in this picture, it's even worse because this is a wheat field. And wheat is wind pollinated. It is not food for bees. So there's nothing in that huge landscape for a bee to eat. So loss of habitat can be very concerning for bees. One of the things that we've learned is that when we do experiments on bees, a diverse diet is related to their health, just like it is in us. So, for example, this is some work that came out of Oregon State. It shows that the multi-source pollen bees, the ones that were experimentally fed a diverse diet in the dark circles, actually over time grew more brood, so more offspring, than those that were fed a single kind of pollen in the open circles. So when their diet is more diverse, they actually can reproduce more and the whole hive does better. And what's especially challenging about pollinator declines is that all these things unfortunately, interact. And so what we see is that when honeybees have high pesticide loads, like I showed you in an earlier slide, if they get exposed to a disease like nosema, they're much more likely to actually contract that disease and get sick. And if they are living on a monoculture diet, a very simple diet as opposed to a diverse diet, once they get something like nosema, they die faster. And this is why colony collapse and honeybee declines in general are so challenging. We're not going to be able to find a silver bullet. We can't just say we're going to ban one kind of pesticides or we're going to do some sort of special thing about one kind of disease that's an emerging problem. It's too complicated for a simple answer like that. And it's because of the basic biology of these animals and the agricultural systems that we are using them in. All of this, of course, is happening when we're planting more pollinator-dependent crops than ever before. So the pink line are crops that need pollinators. They're pollinator-dependent. And over the last 20 years, they've increased in area globally 300%. So we're expecting a lot more from these poor bees, just at a time when all these other problems are happening. Now, the reason that we can do that, again, is because of their basic biology. So I'm going to explain that. This is an almond orchard in California. About 80% of the world's almonds are grown in California, and these trees only bloom for about 2 weeks in like February, and there's a lot of flowers there that need to be pollinated. Huge acreage in almonds. Well, in order to get pollination of such a huge area, you need a vast army of pollinators. Now, if you've read your Winnie the Pooh, then you know that naturally honeybees would live in a hollow tree, right? So they live in a hollow tree, which is why Pooh gets stuck, right? He's going in there after the honey. Well, that means if we can give them a hollow tree substitute, like a little white box, then we can bring them, by putting them on a panel van or even an 18-wheeler, where we need them. Okay? And we put them in these huge monocultures of things like almonds, and they will do the job. The problem is that while we're doing that, we're transporting them over large distances on a truck with just their honey supplies to keep them going. We're exacerbating this whole health problem of having a diverse diet, and then we're putting them in a crop where they might get some pesticide residues in them. It's very challenging to be a bee. Okay. But, okay. One of the things I hope I'm getting across is that the vast majority of the problems that these lovely insects are facing are basically our fault. They're the way that we're managing them for agricultural crop production. And of course, this doesn't apply in other kinds of situations, right? So in these agricultural situations, they're exposed to pesticides, they're eating a monoculture diet, there's high densities, and so there's spread of disease. Some of the healthiest bees on the planet are urban bees, right? So they're not exposed to pesticides, they're in lower densities, so there's lower disease transmission, they're eating a diverse diet. And you get really good honey that way too, I have to say. But I want to be really clear about what this might mean for us. So despite all these challenges, and they're significant, the honeybee is not in any danger of disappearing from our planet. All that stuff in the papers about how we're all going to starve to death, it's just not true. They're not going to disappear from this planet, in part because there's lots of scientists that are trying to solve each of these issues as they come up. And there's also been some changes in recommendations for how to manage them. They're not going to go extinct. But the thing is that there are other bees on this planet. Honeybees are not the only one. And some of those other bees might be actually in more trouble than the honeybee is, and at greater risk of extinction. And one of the things that we know, actually, very recently, from work done just this past year, is wild insects actually may be contributing more to global agriculture than honeybees are. So a high abundance of honeybees, shown in the green dots, supplements rather than substitutes for pollination by other kinds of wild insects. And these are not just bees, they're sometimes flies. We have to thank flies for our chocolate, for example. And in some cases, you can see the green dots and the pink dots, they kind of overlap. And those are cases where the contribution is pretty equal, but in no case are the green dots higher than the pink dots. Basically, honeybees might be getting a little bit too much credit for a situation that is challenging, but maybe not as impossible as it's being made out to be. So the problem is that these wild insects don't necessarily have that whole Winnie the Pooh factor. You can't necessarily bring armies of them to fields. So how does this work, that wild insects are contributing to crop pollination? I'll show you. This is a coffee plantation. And so these are all coffee bushes, okay? So coffee is grown in various regions throughout the world. These data happen to be from Sulawesi. And what they show is that as the number of bee species on the x-axis goes up, the fruit set goes up, right? So we have this increase in production of coffee beans when there's more different kinds of bees. This is kind of like having a diversified portfolio as a way of making more money, right? So that's how diverse communities can support agriculture. And in a study done in Costa Rica, it turned out that the tropical forest supported those wild bees. So these two bars, these first two, are within 50 meters of that tropical rainforest. And these two other bars are 800 meters or more away. And what we see is there's more different kinds of gray, really wonderful color scheme used in this figure. But there's more different kinds of bees, and the bars are higher. There's more visits per unit time when the coffee plantation is near a tropical forest as opposed to when it's away, when there's really just one kind of bee visiting. And what these researchers found is not only were more species visiting, but they basically produced more coffee. With all those diverse visitors, more than 20% additional coffee. And for some of these tropical farms in Costa Rica, that was $60,000 of profit a year. Now it's tempting to say, oh, well, that's a tropical rainforest. We know those are special. Well, let's bring it home. Let's go to blueberry fields. Let's go back to Pitt Meadows, where I've been working with my students for the past few years. What we've learned is that as the amount of natural land in the landscape here on the x-axis increases, so this is stuff like forests and pasture lands and wild places, meadows, as that increases, the abundance of bumblebees in the farms increases. Bumblebees are some of our wild bees here in British Columbia, and they're very good at pollinating blueberries. And what we find is as the amount of natural land goes up, that pollination deficit I mentioned earlier goes down. And when the pollination deficit is zero, that basically means every flower makes a fruit. When there's more natural land near a farmer's field. What we calculated is that our farmers were losing between $3,000 and $6,000 per acre, depending on the cultivar they were growing, because they weren't getting enough pollination. And since some of them have 100 acres or more, again, we're talking a lot of money that they're losing. Okay. Some other students and I were part of a global review of pollination of crops, and we found that basically you get more kinds of bees and more of them just totally when you're near pollinator-friendly habitat. And these are wild spaces that have wildflowers so that the bees can have a diverse diet, and that also have places for the wild bees to nest. And yet, it seems to still all be about the honeybee. When I talk to people, it's all about this beautiful gal in the middle, and it's not about the wild bees. And why is that? I don't really know. I mean, I'm appealing to your bottom line. I'm making this all about food. I'm not even talking about wild ecosystems that are absolutely worth preserving as well, and that wild bees are the only pollinators for. Right? Managed bees like honeybees that are introduced from Europe are not the pollinators of our wildflowers. I figure they have a PR problem, and I'm here to fix that. I'll be their spokesgal, and I'm going to do it like the World Wildlife Fund did it. This is one of my favorite conservation organizations, and in the 1960s they said, we got to get people to care about conservation, and we want them to donate money to help our cause. So they picked a mascot that was cute and fuzzy, and also highly endangered. Well, I got one. Cute, fuzzy, and sadly, highly endangered. This is the western bumblebee. It's been declining in the western part of North America. This is the color form we have. It has a white bum, basically. It's the only bumblebee in our area that does. That map shows where it used to be. It used to be the most common bumblebee in these blueberry farms in the Fraser Valley that I've been working in about 20 years ago. 10 years ago, I think they saw maybe a dozen. In 3 years of looking, we have never seen it. This bee may disappear off the face of the planet. And it used to provide a lot of pollination services to those farms. Okay, so to fix this PR problem, I think I need to explode a few myths and get you excited about wild bees. So much, I think, of what you think you know about bees is about these bees, because they're amazing. And they have an amazing natural history, which is pretty unique to them in all of the bee world. So you probably know that they're social, and there's a queen, and there's workers, and there's like 10,000 sisters that all help each other, and you know that they keep their pollen in a little ball on their leg. It's called a pollen basket, and you might have heard that they sting you once, and then they die. And you know, of course, that every bee is black and yellow stripes. All wrong. All wrong. So we'll start with the easy one, which is how they look. Wild bees can look like just about any color of the rainbow you want. So in the next series of slides, the bee is always on the right. So wild bees can look like wasps, even green metallic wasps. Bees can look like flies. So it's a metallic green mason bee. Or like a metallic blue blowfly, but no, that's a mason bee. Flies can look like bees. So, you know, when they are black and yellow striped, that's warning coloration. It's basically saying, watch out, I could sting you. So the flies are lying, right? But it's basically adapted to look dangerous. I won't say none of them are black and yellow striped. Flies can look like bees. This hoverfly is an amazing mimic of a honeybee, also introduced to this continent. Even I double take on that one sometimes. How about that? A fuzzy bulb fly that even has a red bum, just like a bumblebee. There's also lots of variation in size. I think we all think, okay, a bee's about a centimeter, a little bit bigger. Well, bumblebees are maybe a bit bigger than that. The small carpenter bee, we have these in our area. They're about 3 or 4 millimeters. They're quite tiny. And Megachile pluto, unfortunately not found here, found only in Micronesia, is 39 millimeters. That is thumb size. I know. I know. Okay, lots of variation. The one commonality is that bees are always vegetarians. Okay, so I'm making that as a bit of a joke, but the point is that she's diving in there to get pollen and nectar to feed herself and to bring home and feed her babies. Things like the wasps and flies I was just showing you, well, they tend to be carnivores. So the adult will drink pollen and nectar, that's why they're visiting a flower, but they hunt for things like caterpillars or aphids to feed them. Of course, that can be hard to see when you're trying to figure out what it is in your garden. So, a few tips. Bees have 4 wings and flies have 2, so you need to be able to count. It's a good skill. They're usually hairy, but I showed you some that weren't, so wasps tend to be less hairy. And they're cute, and I am so serious. Are cute. Wasps and flies are less so. So when a student is new, I know it's subjective, but when there's a new student in my lab and I'm trying to get them to tell what something is and they're confused because of some of those pictures I showed you, it can be confusing, I say, have you looked at the face yet? Because this face, I'm sorry, is cuter than that face. This face is cuter. And there is nothing as cute as a boy bee. And for this next part, I sometimes get in trouble because I'm a girl, and since my president is here and he's a boy, I'm going to let a boy quote tell you the next bit. Eminent bee biologist from the UK says, males are essentially lazy. You can see gangs of them sitting on flowers and drinking, and in between drinking, they go looking for mates. And the thing is, it's true. So boy bees don't do any work. They are not collecting pollen and nectar to feed to the hive. or to the offspring if we're talking about a solitary bee. They don't do any work. They are there for one reason only. And they are super cute. So because they don't do any work, they're not welcome in the nest. And so what we see is that they'll either clamp their jaws on a piece of vegetation to sleep at night, or even cuter, they will sleep in a flower, in a little pile of boys. This is a tulip. Very cute. The other thing that's awesome about boy bees is they can't sting you. They don't have the equipment. And so it can be very useful to be able to tell them apart, because then you can impress your friends at parties because you can hold them in your hand. So how do you do that? Well, I've already kind of told you. The trick is that boy bees have mustaches. It is Movember, after all. So the boy bees are on the right. They all have facial hair. Right? See that mustache? Great mustache. Mustache. Okay, male bumblebees, maybe less mustachio, but they definitely are blonder, fuzzier, and overall cuter. And then my favorite one from that earlier slide. I mean, seriously, how cute? How cute? Okay. You've heard that honeybees can sting only once, and that is true, because what happens is they embed their stinger, there's a little barb on the end, it embeds in your skin, and actually the venom sac gets pulled out of their body, and so they wind up dying because it pulls out some of their guts too. Well, the reason that happens, it can keep pumping venom into your arm for like up to 7 minutes or some crazy number. Remember, they're living in a hive with 10,000 sisters. That's a lot of family to protect, and so they have evolved this really amazing defense system with very strong venom. But that's not true of other kinds of bees, and especially our solitary bees. They can sting you as often as they like, but my point is they just don't want to. They're not that into you. That's my finger. I did not get stung. So they can sting you. They will not die if they do it, but generally they're not interested. We have more than 20,000 species of bees on this planet, 800 in Canada, and here in BC, more than 450. That's as many bird species as there are in our whole country. 450. And the reason there's a plus is, unfortunately, we keep finding new ones. I shouldn't say unfortunately, it's kind of exciting. So sometimes it's just because nobody's actually ever done this before in British Columbia. So we don't really have a good list. So we find things that were just not recorded for our province. And every once in a while, we find something that's new to science, like this boy, see the mustache, a male mason bee, that the world expert on mason bees says he's never seen anything like it before. So that's a good news part of the story. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about these different kinds of bees and the ones that we have in our region so that you could maybe be able to tell them apart. And the thing you need to do is you need to check the bee's knees. So that's where you've got to look for where the pollen is. So bumblebees are like honeybees, and they put their pollen in a basket, in a ball, on their leg, just like honeybees do. Other kinds of bees, like mining bees and sweat bees, they put it on their leg, but it's all the way up their leg, kind of to their waist. Right, even on the back of their bodies. And then mason bees are hairy belly bees. They put the pollen on the hairy part up underneath their abdomen. So if you could see where the pollen is, you have an idea of what kind of bee it is. And in a minute, I'll tell you a little bit about what these different kinds of bees need for their nests. And of course, if it doesn't have pollen on it, it might be a boy, because it's lazy, and boys don't do any work, right? Okay, we got that one straight. All right, so a typical bee in our region, the vast majority of bees in our region are solitary. They're not social. There isn't a queen in workers. There's just one single mom trying to get along, okay? And so they emerge and they mate in the springtime. Some of them are summer in our area. They're above ground for only 4 to 6 weeks. They don't live very long, okay? And during that time, they forage for pollen and nectar. They provision a nest. Their larvae will develop wherever that nest is, under the ground or in some wood, and all the adults will die after that 4 to 6 weeks. So you won't see that species again until the next year. Okay, they overwinter as adults, and then the whole thing starts again. Social bees, like bumblebees, and this is to some extent true of honeybees, but they don't have the annual cycle. Well, we have the queens coming out in the spring, and they will lay a nest, and the larvae will develop, and they'll all start foraging, and they'll keep doing that all summer. So they're above ground all summer long. Eventually the queen stops leaving the nest, so she just has everybody come and feed her, and she becomes an egg-laying machine. And not until late summer does she lay any males, and that's when also the new queens are produced. They will mate, and then everybody but the mated queen dies. So the colony only lasts for 1 year. And these colonies are maybe 200 bees. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to show you some pictures of these different kinds of bees. So solitary bees, remember, include the mining bees and the sweat bees, and I put them together because they're a little hard to tell apart sometimes. They tend to have these kind of long, skinny bodies. Often they are black or brown, but some of them are gorgeous, like this metallic green bee. This one's kind of copper colored. They range in size from anywhere from 2 or 3 millimeters up to about 1 to 2 centimeters. They range a lot in size. And they are ground nesters, so that's a little bee bum sticking in out of that pile of dirt. So if you see something like this in your lawn, it's not ants. It could very well be solitary bees, especially if it's only there for about a month in the springtime. This is about 1 meter across. And you'll see them flying close to the ground and going in and out of their holes. It's very cute. This is what it looks like from inside. So I know you can't read this, but this is about 11 or 12 centimeters deep, and these are the cavities that are dug by this bee. So they're like little dogs digging these little cavities, and this bee is only about 1 centimeter long. It's very small. It digs that deep cavity, it lines it so that it's waterproof, it provisions it with a ball of pollen, it lays an egg. Does this about 10 or 20 times and then dies, I think, of exhaustion. All right? And that's it for her whole life. Hairy belly bees, in contrast, tend to live in cavities. And so, remember, these are the ones that have the pollen up underneath the abdomen. They'll happily live in something like a bee condo. Some of you might keep mason bee condos in your yard. And what they're really known for are the different ways that they make their nests. But I'll point out that some of them are quite gorgeous, like this metallic kind of aqua-colored bee. They tend to have robust bodies, kind of chubby little things. The family is called Megachilidae by scientists. That means big teeth, and that's because of these crazy jaws, okay? So not to bite you, but for nest construction. And mason bees, as their name implies, make mud walls in their nests. So this little mason bee on the right has a ball of mud in those jaws, right? So uses the jaws to transport mud to the nest. And the nest would look something like this, with holes going in about 6 inches deep into the wood. Okay, and if you cut that cross section, it looks like this picture up in the upper left, and you see that there are mud walls, there's pollen in there, and a bit of nectar is mixed in, and then the egg is laid. Related species are leaf cutters. They do kind of the same thing, but they use pieces of leaf to line their nest. So if you see something like this phlox plant that was in my garden, you see those kinds of holes, you've got bees. That's not caterpillars. It's not going to kill your phlox. It's fine. It's actually kind of exciting. You've got leaf cutter bees in your garden. And then there's bumblebees. I think most people have an idea about bumblebees. You know what they look like. We have several different kinds here in the lower mainland. Probably 7, I would say, are reasonably common. They are ground nesters, just like the mining bees and the sweat bees are, but they don't dig their own nests. They need existing cavities, and they prefer abandoned mouse holes. But some of them are happy to nest at the ground surface or even a little bit above, and so they'll happily use an abandoned bird nest. So that's what this is. This is a nest box, and there are bumblebees making a nest in there. And this is what the nests can look like. This picture was sent to me by, I don't know, a fan. That was on her back porch under a cabinet, right? And she contacted me because she didn't know what to do about them. And you can see it's kind of glistening in these little honey pots. So that's the nectar that they're going to feed to their offspring. They don't make honey the way honeybees do. Honeybees actually add a special kind of preserving agent to their honey. And so other bees don't do that. And so that's why we can't take honey from something like a bumblebee. And there are other pollinators. You know, I don't want you to think I'm biased or something, but the thing is that all these other things, flies and wasps and butterflies, will visit flowers. They can move pollen, but they simply don't visit flowers anywhere near as often as a bee does. And that's because of what I told you about bees. Bees are actively collecting pollen and nectar to feed their offspring. And because they're doing that, they're visiting flowers way more often than the sexy butterflies and hummingbirds that everybody seems to like better together when they think about making a pollinator garden, for example. Okay. So are you excited about wild bees yet?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. That's good. They're really cool, right? But the question is, are they in trouble? And sadly, the answer is yes. And it's for the same reasons that I talked about with honeybees. Same reasons. I'm going to talk about all three again. So I just thought I'd give you a news story for pesticides. In this past June, there was a mass killing of bumblebees, mostly this species, the yellow-fronted bee, in a parking lot in Oregon. You might have read about it in the news. All these little black dots are dead bumblebees. There was a pesticide, it happened to be a neonicotinoid, that was sprayed on these blooming trees while they were in full bloom because they were infested with aphids. And of course, aphids drop sticky honeydew on cars, and we can't have that, can we? So they brought in a company to basically spray and kill the aphids, and they wound up killing at least 50,000 bumblebees. Pesticides are a problem when they're used inappropriately. Bumblebees also have a high pathogen load in some cases, and that appears to be related to their risk of extinction. So what this kind of confusing looking figure is showing actually is easier to see if I do that and put some circles. We've got 3 species from the west and 3 species from the east, and what this graph is showing is the prevalence of nosema, which is a disease. And we see that these 2 species, which happen to be the ones whose populations have been documented to be declining, have higher pathogen loads than the species they're compared to within regions that have stable populations. So disease is also a problem for bumblebees. And you know what I was telling you before about we need a mascot, bumblebees are better studied than most other kinds of wild bees because they are cute and fuzzy, they're large, they move slow, they're actually way easier to document, and even by citizen scientists, than some of the other bees that are so challenging to identify. Remember, I said we have 450 different kinds in our province. But we've tried to do just that. So for habitat loss, I'll show you some data that came out of my lab. This is done in the Garry Oak ecosystem on Vancouver Island. It's a highly endangered ecosystem. There's only about 5% of the natural area remaining. And what we see is that as the area of the remaining fragment declines, so moves to the left, towards me on this graph, the abundance for the left graph, or the diversity on the right graph of species declines. As we lose habitat, we lose bee species. Okay. So this is a very complicated story, right? It's very difficult to decide what we should be doing about it. And I'm going to tell you one thing that I want you not to do. I don't want you to start keeping honeybees because you heard that the bees were in trouble. If you decide that you want to keep honeybees, I think it's an amazing hobby, and you get to keep the honey, and that's exciting. And those are great reasons to keep honeybees. But the honeybee is not in danger of extinction, and starting to be a beekeeper is not going to save them from extinction, right? It's kind of like, would you keep, if you kept chickens, you'd do it because you wanted the eggs, not because you heard that avian flu is a problem and you were worried about wild bees going extinct, right? Wild birds, sorry, going extinct, right? You would do it for the eggs, not for the conservation part. For conservation, I think we should be thinking about all bees, not just honeybees. And I hope that you'll think also, especially about wild bees. And for some of these things, the answers aren't simple. Diseases especially are something that I think we have to leave in the hands of people that are coming up with new ideas about ways to treat them for honeybees. And for bumblebees or other wild bees, we don't really have answers. It's not something that I could tell all of you to do. For pesticides, I could tell you, well, don't use them. And in the greater Vancouver region, we're not supposed to anyway. So that one's easy. As far as habitat loss, well, what should you do? You should plant a garden. And if all you have is a balcony, you should put out some pots of flowers on that balcony. You should basically do what you can to enhance habitat. And this is good not just for wild bees, but for those honeybees that are foraging not in agriculture, but in neighborhoods. That's my garden. And I'm going to tell you a few things about why this is important to do and how to do it. And I'll start with why by using, again, some of my lab's research. So also over on Vancouver Island, near this endangered Garryoke ecosystem, my students and I have gone out and looked at what's happening in gardens. And what we see here on the left, we have our flowering plants. On the right, we have pollinators. The yellow lines are these garden areas, and the purple ones are these oak savanna wild areas. And what you can see is that the flowering plants peak in early spring and then decline, but they stay higher in both abundance in the top graph and species richness in the bottom graph all season long. Of course, we probably didn't need to measure that to figure that out, right? Of course, gardens have lots of good flowers in them all the time because we want our gardens to be pretty. Well, it turns out that because of this, perhaps, pollinators respond similarly. We have more pollinators in urban areas, especially late, and we have a high diversity of them, higher than in the natural areas, late in the year. Gardens are very good for conserving bee diversity. So a little bit, though, that I have to tell you that is the negative side. They're especially good at conserving the squirrels and raccoons of the bee world, as you might imagine, right? So in urban areas, we get late season species because that's when there's lots of flowers there and not in the natural areas. And we get very generalized species. So we get more honeybees in the urban areas. We get, this is an introduced carder bee. We get these generalist things like the mason bees that like the bee condos. We get some bumblebees that are really generalized. In the endangered oak savanna, we get a different assemblage. We get some bee species that we don't see out in urban neighborhoods. And these include very early flying species that are really only found in those natural areas. And here on the bottom, two examples of two specialist species that get all their pollen from one kind of plant that only occurs in the natural areas. And so we do need to conserve these natural areas to conserve these kinds of bees. But at the same time, urban areas are great reservoirs of bee diversity. So this is one of the gardens near our study area. This is what I would call a highly manicured garden, but it's got lots of food for bees. It's a good place, but I actually quite love this one. Please be kind of open to the idea of lawn weeds, okay? So there's lots of that English daisy there. That's a magnet for pollinators. And let me show you in this. I don't have all the plant species names on here, but it's on our website, so you can see it later. But what this graph is showing is the top 25 plant species in terms of visiting in the gardens. So what do the bees like in these gardens? And the height of the bar tells you something about how popular it was. The first three are on a different scale. It goes up to 300 than the rest of them, which only goes up to 100. So those are the winners, for sure, those first three. But the other thing that you should see is that some of these, like look at number 9. There's lots of different colors. Here, the colors are different kinds of pollinators, different kinds of bees. And so if you plant thyme because you like to eat it, you're going to get a lot of different kinds of pollinators. And here's that English daisy right there. And number 3 is lawn clover. I was surprised actually that we didn't see dandelion in the top 25, but I think it was right out. Dandelions are fabulous for bees. Other things I want to point out, they're on the graph. So some are early flowering, like heather is very early. Mustard greens are very early. So if you have a garden and you planted some mustard greens, don't pull them out now. Leave them go, and then they'll bolt in the springtime before you're even ready to think about planting. Wow, is that great for bees and flies and you name it. They love it, and look at the different colors that are in there. Lots of diversity. Okay? Some of these are late, like asters. So look at the diversity there. Asters are still blooming in my garden. They're great for any bees that come out on a warm day. And flies, and everything, okay? They're great late season species. But the one I really need to point out is the number one plant right here, it's lavender. Okay, now most of that bar is yellow. That happens to be bumblebees, so it's especially attractive to bumblebees. But the super exciting thing I have to tell you about lavender is we saw the western bumblebee on it. In 7 years working on the island, we had never seen it, and we saw it in gardens. More almost than we saw it in natural areas, and only late in the year. So I'm a big fan of gardens, and I'm kind of open to the idea of it doesn't have to be a native species you're planting. It just has to be something that won't escape and mess up natural areas and that the bees like. Now, my husband tells me that not everything I put in the garden has to be for the bees, but I beg to differ. And I hope that you will consider planting something that the bees will like. So what are good things to think about if you're going to try to do this for bees? Well, number one is lots of different colors, shapes, and sizes. So if you have lots of different colors, shapes, and sizes of flowers, you're going to have lots of different colors, shapes, and sizes of bees. Seems simple, right? Larger patches are better than one of each. So, a big mass of something. And extend bloom time. So I think the most important time actually is early. So, be the envy of your block. Plant something that blooms in February or March, right? A lot of our native bees are not out in February, but occasionally honeybees are coming out. They're hungry too. Something like Oregon grape blooms very early, okay? And late, things like asters, or this is Indian blanket, that's a native species that you can actually sometimes find locally, is a great late flowering species. These are the times when other people don't necessarily have food in their gardens for bees, so you be the exception. And these are all just a good garden design. This is what the garden magazines say you're supposed to do anyway, right? So make a good garden, you're gonna have good bees. Okay, and the other thing I want to tell you to think about is nesting requirements. I went to the natural history of our pollinators. Well, that tells you something about what they need in terms of where to live. We all need food to eat and a place to live, right? That's true of bees just like it is of us. So there are commercially available houses for these cavity nesters like the hairy belly bees, or you could make them. This is a homemade one that has different size holes so that you could actually have different kinds of bees living in it. You can even make a bumblebee house, although I don't know how well they work, but since they're using the chickadee nest boxes in my neighborhood, I thought I'd give it a shot. You can plant plants that have hollow stems. So that is a cross-section of a blade of grass, actually. So things like raspberries and hydrangeas have hollow stems, and a lot of our bees will nest in them. And also, this is a ground nesting bee right there, and there's a couple other little ones here. Be open to the idea of some bare ground, and you may be surprised that you might get some garden. Okay. And these ideas are not just for gardens. We can use them more broadly. We were contacted by Metro Vancouver to help them evaluate how well habitat restorations are working in their parks. They didn't do these for bees. They did them because it's the right thing to do. They take these highly invaded areas with lots of Himalayan blackberry and reed canary grass. They remove the invasive and they plant it in a diversity of native plants. And what we found is that the diversity, and I'm not showing it, but the abundance of pollinators is higher in these restored areas than in the invaded ones. It's the same idea. Plant it and they will come. And we're starting to use this in our agricultural research as well. So my colleagues in the Integrated Crop Pollination Project are planting bee pastures, and we're going to try it up here in BC as well. So this is a hedgerow in California. This is a huge bee pasture with that in the background that's a blueberry field. And it takes a little time to build up those wild bee populations, but eventually it happens, and you wind up seeing that the farmers make a better profit because of these bee pastures. Now, this is not going to replace the importance of honeybees in our agricultural ecosystems. Those agroecosystems are huge monocultures that need help. They need us to be able to bring bees into those places. But we want insurance, and that's what these bee pastures can do. So a few resources, and I'll put these web pages up again on my final slide. I love the Xerces Society. They're all about invertebrate conservation. They have lots of information about good native plants, guides for making bees and bee nests, that sort of thing. And I have to put in a plug for the Earthwise Society. They're local. They're based in Tsawwassen. You should go see their garden. And they've actually done a study of which plants in their garden are most attractive to bees, and it's here on their website. You should also check out my website. So some of the information I've been talking about today, we've now put on the website because we found the public just wants to know. So we have information about the different kinds of bees and that graph I showed you with all the different flowering plants that you can put in your gardens. So my take-home messages for you. And those websites are right there, okay? My take-home message is, first, remember to thank a bee for 1 out of 3. 1 out of 3 bites you eat is thanks to a pollinator. We should be acknowledging that when we're eating our dinners. There are more than 450 species of bees here in British Columbia. That is more than there are birds in our country. We rule. We have more bees than any other province. But some of those bees are at risk of extinction, and so we should be thinking about ways to support them. And one of the things we know is that conserving wild areas is good for those wild bees. It's also good for our farmers and our food security. And finally, we know that gardens in urban areas support bees. And so please plant a garden. Thank you.
Thank you. Whoop, there we go. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. My takeaway message from this is we can save a lot of time by not getting rid of dandelions and cutting our lawn when there's clover, and put it into planning more things for the time we would have otherwise done. I certainly like the first part. All those dandelions I used to have to pull out as a kid. I feel guilty. We do have some time if you have some comments or questions, so feel free if anyone wants to put up their hand. I think I'll do the Phil Donahue thing and come around with a microphone so we can, I've always wanted to do this. Go back here and ask a question.
Hi, my question is, have any studies been done on the relationship between the honeybee and the bumblebee? I live on 10 acres on Vancouver Island, and I have thousands of bumblebees. I also have 3 hives, and my observation has been that they are territorial. So if the bumblebee gets out first in the season and claims the lavender, the honeybee won't go to the lavender. Is that correct?
I don't know that anybody's ever studied that, so maybe we need to come and document it. We could publish a paper together and then everybody will know. What I do know is that there is competition. So there is definitely competition between especially honeybees and other kinds of bees, and it's because honeybees will have these big colonies, lots of bees, right? So they're able to more effectively use resources than some of the wild bees are. There is some suggestion that we lose some bee diversity when there's lots of honeybees around, but 3 colonies, if you've got lots of natural areas, it's not going to be enough for that negative interaction to happen.
Well, I find that the bumblebees are actually the winners.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. So I've never seen that personally. There is data that shows that honeybee colonies that are placed near honeybee colonies tend to grow less fast because they have trouble getting enough resources. So I think it's pretty exciting that you've got some winners in your garden. That's great.
You might want to get a research grant and follow up on that. Anyone else?
Right here.
Right here.
There was an article in the Vancouver Sun 2 or 3 days ago about Canada banning bringing the honeybees in to Canada because of them. Was it the mites or something? Is that a problem?
So there is a lot of interest in keeping honeybees from outside of the country from coming in because we're trying to prevent the movement of diseases into the country. The challenge is that we have most of those diseases in our country. So I think it's not a bad idea, but I think sometimes it is brought a little bit too far. Currently, we do allow queens to be brought in. They have to be inspected that they're pest-free, but not whole colonies. And that's because the whole colonies, it would be harder to be sure that they were pest-free. So it is trying to prevent areas where there aren't bad infestations of these diseases and parasites from them getting worse. For many years, we were able to keep some of these things off of Vancouver Island because we were so careful about what got to go on Vancouver Island. Unfortunately, that's no longer true, but these kinds of barricades can be quite useful for maintaining bee health. Yeah.
Another question right up front here.
Hi, I'm asking this on behalf of a friend of mine who's a great gardener and has, won prizes at the garden club and all that. She said this year she didn't see a lot of bees, and she didn't get much in the way of tomatoes this year, whereas last year she was just covered. And she was told by, Garden Works, that it wasn't a bee issue, it was a wind issue, and the tomatoes didn't get enough wind, so she was told to go out there and just basically shake them in the morning.
Okay.
Well, that makes sense, yeah.
Okay. Where shall I begin? So I'll start with, I often often hear from people, oh, this year I didn't have a lot of bees. Oh, this year I had lots of bees. And, there's a lot of variation from year to year in weather, for example, that will affect how well the colonies establish in the spring and how well they do for the year. So there's lots of fluctuations over time in these wild bee populations. So one bad year does not, like, a dire situation make. Tomatoes, like blueberries, are buzz pollinated. So the pollen is actually inside the anther and has to get shaken out, like shaking salt from a shaker, okay? So bumblebees are good at this because they can basically vibrate their bodies and get it out. And that's why honeybees are not the best pollinators of some buzz pollinated things. They don't buzz. So they'll go to our blueberries because they can get nectar, but they won't even go to a tomato plant. You really do need bumblebees. Wind will shake it around, but not very much. Her shaking it is better. Better is an electric toothbrush. Done it myself. It works. So if you don't have bees, you can simulate that with a toothbrush.
Little product placement there.
Let's bring it on.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience. My question is, what is the impact of bee reduction in the third world countries? And two, is there any role seniors and grandparents can play? Because a lot of seniors retire to start a garden.
That's great. We know that in some developing countries, the situation is actually not as bad. And that is in part because in places like Africa, honeybees are native, and they seem to be, many of them, less highly managed. They're just in the environment, and so we're finding that their health is a bit better. So, but that varies a lot across the globe. We do have information globally about pollination problems in various places. It really depends on the way the agriculture is done. Here in North America, we have large-scale, vast monocultures with lots of chemical inputs. Those are way worse for bees than some other ways of growing crops. I do think the best thing that you can do is to plant a garden. You can also consider putting out things like nest boxes, and I have been working with various conservation organizations to think about how we can do more citizen science. Are there ways that we could have people say, I saw this bumblebee in my yard, and we could keep track of that kind of information, and we might then get long-term trends about pollinators. And if that happens, I will be putting information on my website and trying to solicit people like yourself to get involved.
Anyone else? Over here?
Could you make a comment on GMO as related to the decline of the bees?
I sure can. So the thing about genetically modified organisms, I would say here in Canada, the most common thing that we see is Roundup Ready canola or similar, right? So something that has been genetically engineered so that we do not have to worry about spraying a herbicide on the field. So we wind up spraying herbicides a fair bit. This is different for other kinds of genetic modifications, but if we stick with what we know we have a lot of in Canada, that's the situation. So we spray a lot of herbicides to get rid of weeds because the canola can handle it, and we wind up having a field that a farmer would call clean because it doesn't have any weeds in it. Well, let's think about what I was talking about tonight. It means there's not a great diversity of other things for bees to eat. So they have a more limited diet. You have fewer kinds of bees in the field. We know of one, there's one study that was done out of SFU several years ago in canola in Canada that found that the number and, well, the abundance and diversity of bees in genetically modified fields was much lower than in conventional fields, which were lower than in organic fields. And it was mostly because of this difference in the plants, in the diversity of weeds, not anything to do with the canola itself. And so the pollination deficit was lowest in the organic field where there are lots of different kinds of bees, intermediate, and the conventional and low. I mean, especially high, especially lots of pollination deficit for the genetically modified one. I want to be careful, though, to say that GMOs are not necessarily evil. So one of the things that's come out recently is that some genetically modified plants that are modified for resistance to, say, caterpillars that eat them means that they're spraying less pesticides in those fields. That can actually be environmentally good, but what we don't always know are what these other effects are on things like pollinators. That's not always tested, but so far there have been no cases, to my knowledge, of a genetically modified organism directly harming a pollinator. We just have not documented that.
Anyone else? Over here?
well.
This is good. I'm getting my exercise and everything.
So yeah, I just learned that there are many, many different species of bees, not just the honeybee. And I was just wondering, is there a certain species locally that is most endangered? And I'm probably wondering that there are some that have already gone extinct.
One of the challenges of figuring out extinction, so that's a great question. One of the challenges, though, is that you need records to say, okay, well, what did we used to have and what do we have now? It's because before I came along, people weren't doing this so much. We don't have great records, unfortunately, for BC, but the most endangered bee in BC is the western bumblebee that I showed you a picture of with the white bum. Keep your eyes open for it. Other bees, we just don't know. And so what we're going to be doing now, we've started doing some monitoring. As we continue to do that, we might have a better idea of which populations are in decline. Unfortunately, we don't know other than the western bumblebee right now.
So I'll take 2 more questions or comments, and I see one over in the far side of the room here, and then we'll come back to the front here. Maybe we'll make it 3.
Hi. Got two questions from different points. I have a fairly diverse garden at home, and it's got a lot of pollinators, which is great. I was thinking about getting keeping honeybees for interest, but also to also boost pollination as well. Would you suggest that that should not be the reason? I mean, so are there other things that I could do instead? Because obviously there's a time commitment to that. There's a stewardship you have to have. There's knowledge that has to be put into that. So that would be, I guess, my one question, first of all.
Okay.
Can you answer that?
So if I would say do it for that first reason you said, for the interest. If you're interested, you should totally do it. It's awesome, right? But don't do it because you're worried about pollination in your garden unless you have some evidence that there isn't any. Like I was just saying before, the honeybees won't even pollinate your tomatoes, right? So you need to think about, do you have a pollination problem where you really need to be bringing in bees, or can you just be encouraging your wild bees? You probably have, like you said, you think you have a lot. You probably have more than you think even. Yeah. You'll look at them differently now that you know that they can be these tiny little things, right?
Yeah, wild sage is actually a really good one.
Fabulous.
The second question is, so why is it that so much attention is focused on honeybees as opposed to wild bees? Is it because there's a human connection to honey as being a food for humans? Is that the dominating reason?
So I wish I knew. I don't know, because there are so many people who really think there's only one kind of bee. We all know there's not one kind of bird on the planet, but we all seem to say the bee, as if it's one kind of bee. I don't know. I think it is that we have a very, very long connection, going back at least to Egyptian times, documented with honeybees. We have an amazing relationship with them because of honey, and it's been more recently that we've started using them for crop pollination. I think that's the main reason. And the other is that you can see them, so I think a lot of people have a vague idea of what a honeybee hive looks like. We see them out in the landscape. You can see them moving around, right? Whereas a lot of our wild bees, people don't even realize they're a bee. There's something in their garden, they don't know what that thing is. It's some fly, or it's a wasp, it's gonna sting me, or it's whatever, right? So I think part of it is just not recognizing all these other things.
And how cute those other things are.
Yeah, cute.
There's another question up front here.
It occurred to me you didn't show charts for good reason that we don't have records. How do you take a synoptic census of several different species of bees, which I guess is what you would like to do?
Yeah. And it's what we have been doing. So I did show you that graph that showed that we know that some small fragments have fewer kinds of bees than large fragments. So what we have to do is we have to go out and collect them. And unfortunately, we can't identify them to species out in nature. This is kind of a challenge when you're a conservation biologist. I will admit that we have to kill a lot of bees. Because without collecting them and bringing them back and putting them under a microscope, we cannot figure out what they are. So we try to do this in a way, of course, where we're minimizing how many that we're collecting. But if we didn't collect them and stick them on a pin, like in those pictures, we would never have known that we had a species that was new to science. So we collect them with a couple of different methods. We use nets, we use pan traps, so brightly colored bowls of soapy water. So they think it's like the biggest, happiest flower you've ever seen, and then they kind of dive in and the soap makes them drown. So it's a very passive collection method, yeah. But that's, unfortunately, that's what we have to do. But that's part of why we don't go out year after year after year to the same sites. We go out and then we'll go out 5 years later. We really want to make sure that we don't have that in trying to understand the problem, we don't want to be a cause, right? Yeah.
So that's it for the questions, but there will be a chance, as I said, if you want to stay back. Professor Elle has very kindly agreed to hold back to answer any individual questions you have within a reasonable time, of course, and there are some snacks over there. But look, I really want to, on your behalf, thank her for just a fabulous presentation. You know, I said at the outset, our goal as SFU is to be Canada's most engaged research university, and what was great about tonight's lecture, I think, is not only did we learn some interesting facts and new insights about bees and pollination, but we got some instruction about what we can do to help improve the situation. And that transfer of knowledge, therefore, it really encourages and challenges us to be part of the solution. And that's what really great research should do. And I want to, on your behalf, thank Dr. Elle for sharing her research with us and challenging us to help her so that she can document hopefully a positive situation for bees and pollinators in the years ahead. Thank you so much.